In keeping with the theme of the conference, which is what's next, I want to do a brief overview of some structural things about Aboriginal policing in Canada, look at briefly where it's come from, and perhaps some suggestions on where it's going, also where it is right now. The nature of Aboriginal policing in Canada has changed very dramatically over the last few decades. Aboriginal policing, in fact, began in Canada in 1971 when the Department of Indian Affairs and Northern Development, DIAND, introduced a policy that allowed for the establishment of band constable systems. Now, the band constables were intended to supplement and not to replace the police services operating in First Nations territory. The band constables were not deemed to be members of the senior police services. They received very modest training. They were not considered full-fledged provincial peace officers, but rather special constables on appointment. They carried no weapons. They had powers of arrest, essentially only those that the rest of us have as ordinary citizens. And it was a beginning, but it was a very token kind of program. While Aboriginal policing slowly evolved over the years, the real change began with a series of reports, inquiries, and commissions in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and these were done in virtually every province across the country. And these reports were critical of policing in First Nations communities. They criticized its effectiveness in terms of sensitivity to cultural considerations, a lack of community input, biased investigations, minimal crime prevention being done in the communities, and a system that fostered alienation from the justice system by Aboriginal people. Several of these commissions, including Manitoba's Aboriginal Justice Inquiry, which I worked on, concluded that these problems could best be dealt with through a separate and distinct First Nations controlled and administered system. And all of them agreed on the need for a more innovative and culturally appropriate style of policing Aboriginal people. By the early 1990s, we started to see some really significant organizational changes in Aboriginal policing. By 1990, there were 2 First Nations self-administered police services with officers having full provincial status comparable to municipal police officers. And these were firsts. These were the Louis Bull Police Service in Alberta, which was started in 1987, Six Nations Police Service in Ontario that started in 1989. And at the same time, there were major shifts in government policy and in the tone and thrust of academic and governmental research on First Nations policing. And in both the cases, the shifts were in the direction of promoting greater responsiveness to distinctive First Nations traditions and realities, greater Aboriginal presence in the police service, and increased administrative control by First Nations communities. And this culminated in 1991 with probably the most important development in Aboriginal policing in Canada when the federal government approved the First Nations policing policy. And this transferred the policing budget and fiduciary responsibility from DIAND to the Solicitor General. And it established the objective of negotiating tripartite policing agreements between the federal, provincial, and band governments with all willing First Nation bands, where the costs of on-reserve policing would be shared by the senior levels of government, 52-48 with the feds paying the most, but allowing the bands to top up the budget for any special activities or enhanced services that they wanted. There were 10 principles articulated by this First Nations policing policy, but essentially it defined effective or good First Nations policing as a level of service comparable to that received by non-Native communities under similar conditions, subject to significant First Nations control and direction, and also responsive to the distinctive traditions and social circumstances of First Nations communities. And not surprisingly, in the years that followed, the police services under this agreement or under this policy have grown really quickly. The Aboriginal Policing Directorate was established in the Federal Solicitor General's Department in 1992, and it's responsible for negotiating agreements with the other 2 partners. The Directorate's also helped to organize several First Nations police governance organizations, which are needed in order to help increase community capacity to oversee these police forces. Now, the policing policy allows for 2 models of policing. The first are self-administered police services, where the First Nations community is the employer. The police officers work for that community. This model currently involves 47 agreements involving 191 communities. Most of these are in Ontario, Quebec, and Alberta. And one of them, particularly very large, the Anishinabe Naski Police Service in Ontario, polices an area about the size of France and has close to 100 police officers, a very significant police service. In these services, the Band Council is responsible for the police force, but it can delegate some of its powers over the police to a police commission, and normally that is done. The second model involves what are called community tripartite agreements, or CTAs. The RCMP is the employer here, but they try and involve, and in most cases do involve, Aboriginal officers in the communities doing the policing. Now, they've got 75 agreements covering 111 communities, so over 300 communities are right now in Canada covered under these policies. In the CTAs, there's no police commission or equivalent. Again, they don't work for the band directly, but there is a community consultative group to provide a forum for police community dialogue. All told, there are 900 police officers under the First Nations policing program, and 2/3 of these are in the self-administered forces, which are the larger ones. Now, while these models are still evolving, they seem to be moving in the right direction. I'm working right now on an evaluation of some of the self-administered programs, and we don't have many of the results of that in yet. But earlier assessments have found that there are certainly many more Aboriginal police officers, especially if we go back to 1971. Police services have increasingly become formally self-administered in First Nations communities. The surveys have shown there's a much greater sense of ownership in communities with self-administered police services, as you'd expect. These forces are also more responsive and more accountable to their communities. The negative parts of the evaluation, I guess, are perhaps less positive rather than negative would be a better way to put it. The policing style and practice was pretty much the same as mainstream police. There was hopes that Aboriginal police forces would develop a different style. I think they may, but that hasn't happened yet. Also, there's a lot of resource issues that have to be addressed in the future because many of these services deal with small, very isolated communities. That kind of policing is very, very expensive, and especially if, as is the case, these communities want a higher level and a different form of policing than has traditionally been the case. There's also issues involving the capacity to govern these forces, backup training, and those sorts of things that still have to be addressed.